forgotten phantom king of Angkor. The jungle had swallowed the truth whole, and for 700 years, nobody thought to ask what it was choking on. You stand in the archives of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient in Siem Reap, holding a palm leaf manuscript that shouldn't exist. The edges crumble at your touch, releasing the smell of centuries, earth and incense and something else, something like burned sugar. The script is Old Khmer, the kind used in the 12th century, but the carbon dating says 1300, a gap of 100 years, an impossible gap. The manuscript mentions a name that appears nowhere else in the historical record. Tribhuvanad Dyavarman, the Sun King of 3 worlds, a phantom. The official histories of Angkor are precise, almost obsessively so. They tell you that after the death of King Jayavarman VII in approximately 1220, the empire entered a period of decline. They tell you about his successors. Indravarman II, Jayavarman VIII, the gradual conversion to Theravada Buddhism, the slow fade of Angkorian glory. They tell you everything except this, that between 1221 and 1223, someone ruled who was systematically erased from every stone inscription, every royal chronicle, every temple wall. Someone the jungle remembers, even if history doesn't. The first clue came from the trees. A French botanist named Claudine Mercier was studying the growth rings of dipterocarp trees in the Angkor Archaeological Park when she noticed something odd. Several ancient specimens showed a pattern of accelerated growth during a 2-year period in the early 13th century, followed by sudden stress markers. Trees don't lie about climate. Something had changed in those years. A shift in water management, perhaps, or a dramatic alteration in the forest canopy. The irrigation systems told a similar story. Ground-penetrating radar revealed modifications to the Beret reservoirs that didn't match any known construction phase. Someone had re-engineered the hydraulic network of Angkor with extraordinary sophistication, then abandoned the work halfway through. The modifications used techniques that wouldn't appear in Khmer engineering for another 50 years. You trace the phantom through absence, through the spaces between documented reigns, through the archaeological shadows. The Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan visited Angkor in 1296 and described the customs of the Khmer court in meticulous detail, but he also mentioned something curious. The monks he spoke with referred to a period they called the Silent Years, a time when the temples fell quiet and the royal ceremonies ceased. They wouldn't explain further. Some silences, they said, were mandatory. The stone inscriptions are where the erasure becomes visible. At Taprom, you find a dedication stele from 1222 that's been partially recarved. The original text is still legible beneath the new layer if you know how to look. It speaks of a king who brought the waters to speak and made the stones remember their purpose. But then, chisel marks. Someone had taken great care to obliterate specific passages while leaving the rest intact. You take rubbings, photograph the angles of light across the damaged surfaces, and slowly, impossibly, a name emerges from the stone's memory. Tribhuvanadityavarman, the Sun King of 3 worlds, his reign left physical marks that couldn't be completely erased. At Preah Khan, hidden behind a later addition, you discover a small shrine with astronomical alignments that match no other structure in Angkor. The calculations are breathtaking in their precision. Someone had understood the precession of the equinoxes, had mapped the stars with mathematical accuracy that rivaled anything being done in Song Dynasty China. The shrine was built to capture sunlight on one specific day of the year, the 3rd of February, 1222. You check the Chinese astronomical records. On that date, a total solar eclipse passed directly over Angkor. The path of totality would have turned day to night for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. A sun king who brought darkness at noon. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The Vietnamese annals provide an unexpected fragment. In 1222, they record a diplomatic mission to Angkor that returned in confusion. The embassy had been received by a king who wasn't the expected successor to Jayavarman VII. This king spoke in riddles, they reported, and had covered the palace mirrors with silk. He asked the Vietnamese envoys whether a reflection could rule a kingdom, and whether shadows had more substance than the things that cast them. The envoys concluded he was mad and terminated negotiations. But perhaps he wasn't mad. Perhaps he was asking a more profound question about the nature of power and legitimacy. You find his face in the least likely place, a minor temple called chronicles, dedicated to Jayavarman VII's royal guru. Tucked into a decorative panel, almost invisible unless you're looking for it, is a portrait carving unlike any other at Angkor. The style is wrong for the period, too naturalistic, too psychologically penetrating. The face belongs to a young man, perhaps 30 years old, with eyes that seem to look through stone rather than at the viewer, and there, in the tiny inscription beneath, the name again, Tribhuvanadityavarman. The few fragments of his story that survive suggest someone extraordinary. He appeared at court in 1220, claiming to be the son of Jayavarman VII by a concubine who had lived in the temple of Preah Khan. No one could verify the claim, but no one could disprove it either. He demonstrated knowledge of royal ritual that only someone raised in the palace could possess. He spoke 5 languages fluently, including Chinese and Cham. He could recite the entire Ramayana from memory, and he had ideas about how to save the empire. By 1220, Angkor was already in trouble, though the official inscriptions maintained the fiction of eternal glory. The hydraulic system that had sustained the city for 400 years was failing. Deforestation had destabilized the watersheds, the barais were silting up, the climate was shifting toward drought. The empire needed innovation, needed someone willing to break with tradition. Tribhuvanadityavarman proposed a radical restructuring of the water management system, based on principles he claimed to have learned from treatises brought from India. He wanted to implement a network of smaller, distributed reservoirs rather than relying on the massive royal barais. He wanted to introduce new rice cultivation techniques, new crops, new patterns of settlement. He wanted to reform the corvée labor system that was bleeding the countryside dry. The conservative faction at court was horrified. These proposals threatened the entire cosmological order that Angkorian kingship represented. The barais weren't just irrigation systems. They were replicas of the cosmic ocean. The temples weren't just monuments. They were the axis mundi, connecting earth to heaven. You couldn't simply reorganize them for efficiency. But Jayavarman VII was dying, and in his final months, he made a decision that would haunt the empire. He named Tribhuvanadityavarman as regent, giving him authority to implement his reforms on a trial basis. For 2 years, the Phantom King would have the chance to prove his vision. The archaeological record of those 2 years is thin but tantalizing. Construction began on 17 new reservoirs in a ring around Angkor. New canal systems were dug following principles of gradient and flow that were genuinely innovative. Agricultural experimental stations appeared in the countryside, testing drought-resistant crop varieties. The labourers conscripted for these projects were treated differently, paid in rice and cloth, rather than simply compelled, housed in better conditions, given days of rest. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The rice harvests of 1221 were the best in a generation. The new reservoirs held water through the dry season. The experimental crops proved viable. Tribhuvanadityavarman's reforms were succeeding, and that was precisely the problem. The Brahmin priests, who legitimized royal power through their mastery of Sanskrit ritual, found themselves sidelined. The great families who controlled the temple estates saw their influence waning. The generals who had built careers on conquest watched resources redirected to irrigation and agriculture. The phantom king had accumulated too many enemies too quickly, and he had failed to understand the most important rule of Angkorian politics. Power wasn't about effectiveness, it was about performance. When Jayavarman VII finally died in late 1221, the conservative faction moved quickly. They installed Indravarman II, a royal cousin who represented continuity and tradition. Tribhuvanadityavarman refused to cede power. He claimed that Jayavarman had recognized him as a true son in a deathbed declaration. He argued that his reforms were succeeding and deserved more time. He made the fatal mistake of believing that results mattered more than legitimacy. The civil war that followed lasted less than 6 months, but it was vicious enough to scar the empire permanently. Tribhuvanadityavarman held Angkor Thom itself, along with several major temples. Indravarman controlled the countryside and the loyalty of most provincial governors. The conflict wasn't fought with massive armies. The empire was already too depleted for that. Instead, it was a war of sieges and skirmishes, of water supplies cut off and food stores blockaded, of temples fortified and populations starved. In May of 1222, during the eclipse he had calculated so precisely, Tribhuvanadityavarman attempted a final gambit. He staged an elaborate ceremony at the Bayon, claiming that the darkened sun proved his divine mandate. If the gods had not favoured him, he proclaimed, they would not have written his legitimacy across the sky. For 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the world turned dark in the middle of the day. In that darkness, he declared himself sole legitimate king. It was a magnificent piece of theatre, but it changed nothing. Indravarman's forces breached Angkor Thom's defences 2 weeks later, and Tribhuvanadityavarman vanished into the jungle with a handful of loyal followers. What happened next is the strangest part of the story. Most failed pretenders to the Khmer throne were executed publicly, their deaths inscribed on temple walls as warnings. But there's no record of Tribhuvanadityavarman's death, no triumphant inscription celebrating his defeat, no description of his punishment. Instead, there's a systematic erasure that required time, effort, and coordination. Every inscription bearing his name was recarved. Every temple dedication was modified. Every official document was destroyed or amended. The new reservoirs he had built were attributed to earlier kings or left anonymous. His reforms were quietly maintained. They worked too well to abandon, but credit for them vanished into the administrative record. It was as if the empire had decided that the phantom king was more dangerous as a martyr than as a forgotten footnote. By erasing him completely, they denied him even the dignity of defeat. But erasure is never complete. The jungle keeps its own records. In 1223, a small temple was constructed deep in the forest, far from Angkor's administrative center. It's called Bantai Chmar, though that's not its original name. The structure is modest by Angkorian standards, but the inscriptions are peculiar. They speak of a king who walked among the stones like a shadow, and whose name was Silence. They describe someone who had rejected worldly power to seek a different kind of sovereignty, the sovereignty of understanding, of seeing the empire's problems with clarity, even if he couldn't solve them. Some scholars think Tribhuvanaditya Varman lived out his days at this temple, protected by monks who still believed in his vision. Others suggest he died in the jungle during the rainy season of 1223, just another casualty of the Civil War's aftermath. The Vietnamese annals mention rumors of a Khmer prince living in exile in Champa, teaching astronomy and hydraulic engineering, but they never name him. You prefer to think he survived, at least for a while. The evidence is circumstantial, a pattern of temple construction in remote areas over the next decade that uses his innovative techniques, a series of inscriptions that seem to quote his ideas without attribution, the spread of his agricultural reforms despite official silence about their origin. It's as if his vision outlived his political existence, propagating itself through the empire like seeds scattered on the wind. The supreme irony is that many of Tribhuvanaditya Varman's reforms became standard practice within a generation. The distributed reservoir system he proposed was gradually implemented. The agricultural innovations were adopted. The labor practices were modified in the direction he had advocated. The empire absorbed his ideas even as it erased his name, like a body rejecting a transplanted organ while somehow integrating its function. By the time Zhou de Guan visited Angkor in 1296, the silent years had become a kind of parable. The monks told him that there had once been a king who tried to change too much too quickly, who had forgotten that empires move like trees rather than like water. Fast growth, they said, produces weak wood. The forest knows to grow slowly, to add each ring patiently, to respect the wisdom of gradual change. But you wonder if they were right. Standing in the ruins of Angkor now, with the jungle reclaiming the stones and the berets turned to swamps, you can't help but think that perhaps Tribhuvanaditya Varman's great failure was also his greatest insight. He understood that the empire was dying, that the old cosmological certainties couldn't sustain a civilization facing climate change and resource depletion. He tried to adapt, to innovate, to imagine a different kind of Khmer greatness. And for that vision, he was erased. The palm leaf manuscript you're holding contains what might be his only surviving words, written in his own hand or copied by someone who knew him. The script is elegant, the reasoning clear. He writes about water as if it were a living teacher, about rice as if it contained the secrets of governance, about the relationship between rulers and ruled as a kind of mutual responsibility rather than cosmic hierarchy. It's radical stuff for the 13th century, ideas that wouldn't become common for another 500 years. On the final page, there's a statement that might be his epitaph. A king who cannot be forgotten has failed, for he has made himself more important than his kingdom. Better to be the rain that falls in darkness, unnamed but necessary, than the sun that burns so bright it leaves only desert behind. The phantom king of Angkor understood something that the official histories still haven't grasped. Greatness isn't always written in stone. Sometimes It's written in the patterns of water flowing through carefully engineered channels, in rice growing in drought-resistant varieties, in the small daily miracles of a system that works even after everyone's forgotten who designed it. You carefully return the manuscript to its climate-controlled case, aware that you're handling something that maybe a dozen people have read in 700 years. Outside, the sun is setting over the ruins of the Bayon, turning the stone faces gold and crimson. In this light, you can almost see him, a young man standing at the center of the world, calculating eclipses and water flow, trying to save an empire that didn't want to be saved. The jungle has swallowed most of the evidence, but here and there, if you know where to look, the Phantom King still haunts the stones. His reservoirs still hold water in the right season. His canal systems still follow the contours of the land with elegant efficiency. His ideas still whisper through the archives, anonymous but persistent. History remembers the kings who built the tallest temples, who conquered the most territory, who inscribed their names largest on the surviving stones. But the jungle remembers something else. It remembers the king who understood that water matters more than monuments, that systems outlast personalities, that the greatest power might be the power to disappear while leaving the world slightly better than you found it. Tribhuvanaditya Varman, the Sun King of 3 worlds, the Phantom King of Angkor, he ruled for 2 years and has been forgotten for 700. But his vision remains, encoded in the landscape like a message written in a language the stones are still learning to read. And perhaps that's the only kind of immortality worth having. Not to be remembered, but to have mattered. Not to echo through the ages, but to change them in ways too subtle for history to notice. The eclipse he calculated so carefully passed into darkness and returned to light, as all eclipses do. But the shadow it cast is still there, if you know how to see it, still there in the water flowing through channels he designed, in the rice growing in fields his reforms made possible, in the slow, patient work of trying to imagine a better world, even when the world isn't ready to listen. That's the story the jungle tells in the language of roots and stone and water. The story of the king who was never there, whose reign was a dream the empire tried to forget, whose greatest achievement was to disappear so completely that his ideas could survive without him. The forgotten Phantom King of Angkor, whose absence speaks louder than any inscription. The silent cathedrals of time, abandoned temples of forgotten faiths. By the time the world forgot the gods, their houses were already crumbling. Stone gives way slowly, more slowly than memory, so that the last worshipper may die centuries before the last column falls. Wind and rain go on whispering the names no one speaks, polishing the steps no one climbs. In that interval, between the fading of a faith and the collapse of its last sanctuary, something strange happens. Temples become cathedrals of time. I did not set out to find them. At least, that is what I said to myself the first night, when the airplane window showed a black ocean and a thin curve of moon, and the engine's hum merged with the ache behind my eyes. I told friends that I was doing research on comparative religion, on the archaeology of forgotten cults. It sounded polite, academic, respectable, but the truth is that I was tired of quick opinions and faster vanishing headlines, of gods that lasted 3 seasons of a streaming show and then were replaced. tired of the way even the great religions, the living ones, were argued over like brands. Somewhere under that weariness was an impulse I could not quite name, a need to listen to something older than the noise. So I followed rumors, footnotes, and half-legible translations. I followed the way a strange name glows on a page, the way embers glow in ashes. I followed flights and buses and dirt roads until one morning the sun hauled itself over a desert horizon and I saw the first of the silent cathedrals. It rose from the plateau like a piece of dawn that had hardened into stone. From a distance the temple looked simple. 4 square walls and a flat roof, all of it carved from a pale glass-sheened rock that caught the light and scattered it. Up close, the simplicity dissolved into intricacy. Every surface was etched with lines so fine they were almost invisible. Rays, arcs, spirals, intersecting at strange angles. At first I thought of stars, then of something older than stars. My guide, a taciturn man in a sand-coloured scarf, stopped the jeep a respectful distance from the ruins. "We go on foot," he said. "Road ends here." And he searched for a word in English. "Voices." "What kind of voices?" I asked. He lifted one shoulder. "Place remembers. Some people hear it, some do not." His eyes flicked to mine. "You're the kind who hears, I think." The air tasted of dust and light. Heat was already uncoiling off the ground. The wind was cool and carried a faint metallic tang, like old coins. As we walked, the temple shifted subtly with each step, its edges blurring, like something seen underwater. Mirages wobbled on the horizon, but this structure remained unnervingly clear, unnervingly present. Up close, I saw that the entrance was a low, narrow slit, no taller than my shoulders. Above it, carved into the stone lintel, was a symbol, a circle broken in 3 places, with a tiny inverted triangle at its heart. "You know the name of this place?" I asked my guide. "It has no name," he said. "Or rather, too many. The old stories." He waved a hand. "Sky Temple. House of the First Light. Shrine of the goddess who turned away." People tell stories when they see something they do not understand. "You don't believe any of them?" He thought about it. "I believe the stone. It is older than the stories. Stories follow stone, not the other way." Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The light, instead of fading, seemed to thicken, turning the air into something like pale honey. The hall beyond the entrance was narrow and long, its walls converging toward a point of brightness at the far end. My footsteps sounded small and disrespectful. Thin grooves ran along the floor, so shallow they were almost smooth. Where they met the walls, the etchings there flared into cascades of lines that curved around each other in dedications to geometry I could not read. "It's like a sundial," I murmured, tracing one line with my fingertip. The stone felt unexpectedly warm, as if heat were running inside it like blood. But inside, underground. "Not a sundial," said a voice from the shadows ahead. "At least, not for this sun." I started so violently I almost fell. My guide merely inclined his head, as though he had been expecting this. A man stepped out from the bright haze at the end of the hall. He wore clothes that could have been taken from any era, a plain dark coat, trousers tucked into scuffed boots, a wide-brimmed hat whose shape refused to settle on a century. There was nothing remarkable about his face, except that, like his clothes, it would not stay still in my mind. Every time I looked away and back, I was sure he had been younger, or older, or differently shaped around the eyes. "I'm sorry," I said, heart still thudding. I was told no one lived out here." "No one does," he said. "I only keep watch." He extended a hand. "You can call me the keeper, if it helps." "Of what?" I asked automatically. "Of dust, of stories, of the places in between." His hand was warm and dry, his grip both firm and oddly weightless, as though he might drift away if I let go. "You've come to listen, haven't you?" I hesitated. "To learn, perhaps." "Learning is a species of listening," he said. "Come." We walked together down the narrowing hall. My guide stayed at the entrance, muttering something under his breath that might have been a prayer. The grooves in the floor deepened, and the lines on the walls grew denser, overlapping until they formed a shimmering lattice that hurt my eyes. "There was a faith here once," the keeper said conversationally. "They had no word for God, only for the one who was before. They believed the sky was a wound in the body of the universe, and that light was blood spilling through." "That's vivid," I said. "They were vivid people. They measured that blood with great care." He touched the wall with his fingertips, and for an instant the lines around his hand flared, like embers stirred by a breath. "They carved the paths of suns you've never seen. They charted the turning of stars that were old when this planet was gas and fire. Time for them was not a river, but a cathedral. Rooms within rooms, all resonant at different frequencies. This place," his hand described a small arc taking in the hall, the temple, the blazing sky beyond, "was their tuning fork." We reached the far end of the hall. Instead of a sanctum or altar, there was a circular chamber open to the sky. The roof had been cut away, or perhaps it had never existed. Walls rose in a smooth curve, their surfaces carved with spiraling grooves that all led upward, converging on the ragged circle of blue. In the center of the floor, a shallow basin of the same glass-like stone held a faint trace of darkness, like a shadow that had run out of substance. There were no statues, no offerings, no relics. "They worshipped time?" I asked. "In a sense." The keeper tilted his head back, eyes half closed against the glare. "They worship the before, the possibility that what came first still vibrates through what came after, that by listening just right, they could hear the first note." "And did they?" He smiled faintly. "For a while. Every faith hears its God for a while. That is how faith survives its birth. But there are no temples in this world whose worshippers do not eventually stop listening. The miracle is not that faiths die." He touched the basin with the back of his knuckles. "It is that their houses remain, long enough to remember for them." A gust of wind swept into the chamber, bringing with it the smell of far-off rain. For an instant, the basin darkened, and I thought I saw movement there. Not a reflection of the sky, but of something deeper. A skyscape in which the stars were arranged in unfamiliar constellations, an ink-blue firmament streaked with slow, luminous rivers. Then the wind passed, and the illusion with it. "What happened to them?" I asked. "People who built this place?" "What happens to all such people?" the keeper said softly. The sky changed, slowly, then all at once. The wound shifted. Blood fell differently. Their measurements ceased to match the world. They had poured themselves into this tuning fork, and the note it gave back no longer fit. Some tried to adjust. Some clung to the old patterns, insisting the sky was wrong, not they. Some walked out into the desert and followed the receding constellations until they died of thirst, still counting. And the temple? The stone stayed. Long after the last believer lay forgotten in the sand, the grooves remained. The walls continued to sing in the language of a sky that no longer existed. He opened his hands as if balancing invisible weights. No one listened, and yet time listened. It always does. That is when these places become what they are now, the silent cathedrals. Silent? I echoed. It doesn't feel silent. He glanced at me. You hear them then? What are they saying? That depends on who you are when you arrive, he said, and who you will be when you leave. We stood together in the strange, cool light, listening to something that was not exactly sound. It was like feeling the pulse in your wrist, a rhythm that had always been there, but which you notice only when you stop and pay attention. Images rose unbidden in my mind. Generations kneeling on this stone, eyes raised to a long-gone sky, hands tracing grooves into rock with patient tools, a child pressing her ear to the basin to hear the echo of stars. The feeling was not reverence so much as recognition. The people who had prayed here were gone, their God silent, their sky replaced. The hunger that had built this temple, the hunger to locate themselves in something vast and enduring, felt familiar. After some unmeasured time, the keeper touched my elbow. Come, he said, there are other cathedrals. Time is patient, but your body is not. You will need food, water, sleep. You're coming with me? I asked. For a while, until we reached the next one. His smile was wry. Besides, you may not find them without me. They do not appear on maps the way you think. On the drive back, my guide muttered about spirits and omens, and kindly but firmly refused my offer of extra payment if he would agree to take us to the second site. This is as far as I go, he said, hand tightening on the steering wheel. You want more old stones? Talk to your friend. My friend. I turned, but the keeper, who had sat in the jeep's shadow and spoken quietly with me moments before, was nowhere to be seen. Desert stretched unbroken on every side, shimmering with heat. He left, my guide said with a shrug. People like that, they come and go. You will see him again, if you're meant to. I almost protested that no one could have walked away into that open vastness without kicking up dust or leaving footprints. Instead, I closed my mouth, buckled my seatbelt, and watched the tempo recede in the rearview mirror. The sun climbed higher, turning the pale stone into a white flame against the sky. And then it was gone. For a time, my life seemed to resume its usual shape. There were hotel rooms and flights, emails and receipts, snippets of ordinary conversation. The memory of the desert temple faded at the edges, like a vivid dream. But I noticed myself pausing longer than necessary in museums, lingering in the rooms devoted to unknown cult, 3rd century BCE, or ritual object, culture undetermined. I found my eyes tracing the cracks in old statues, wondering what vibrations still lived in their stone. It was in a museum, in fact, that I saw the second cathedral. It was not the cathedral itself, of course. It lay many thousands of miles away, in a jungle I had never imagined visiting. It was a fragment a borrowed piece, set behind glass with a neat label. Carved stone panel. Provenance: unknown river valley civilization, predating regional records. Symbolic imagery suggests ritual significance. The panel was no larger than a laptop screen, its edges worn and chipped. It showed a stylized archway surmounted by coiling vines, and beyond it a series of steps descending into waves. Above the arch, etched in delicate lines, was the same broken circle I had seen over the desert temple's door. Only here the inverted triangle at its heart had been replaced with a tiny curling spiral. A small note at the bottom of the placard read, "Similar motifs found at submerged temple complex. Coordinates on file with research department." I stood there long enough that a security guard ambled over to ask if I was alright. "Fine," I said, but my voice sounded distant to my own ears. Could you tell me where these coordinates are? The submerged complex?" He gestured toward the help desk. "Ask there, but I doubt they'll give you that kind of information." They did not. The woman at the desk smiled apologetically and spoke of preservation, safety, the need for permits. I nodded and thanked her, and later that night, in the quiet of my hotel room, I searched for the fragment's accession number in academic databases. There were papers, of course there were papers, discussing the river enclosure site, its puzzling isolation, its curious iconography. There were also, buried deeper, references to a certain independent consultant who sometimes appeared in field reports under titles like temporal site verification or non-standard chronology assessment. The name listed was not the keeper, of course, but the initials were the same. By that point, I was no longer pretending, even to myself, that I had stumbled into this. When you have heard a stone sing, you do not return easily to silence. The jungle was nothing like the desert, and yet they shared a certain density of time. In the desert, time lay exposed, flat and immense, unrumpled by foliage. In the jungle it grew in layers, leaf over leaf, vine over branch, fallen tree over stone. Every inch of ground seemed occupied by roots or rot or new growth, and the air hummed with insects and hidden birds. The boat that carried me upriver was a narrow wooden thing, its small engine coughing now and then in protest. The water was the color of old copper, opaque and slow-moving, carrying leaves, twigs, and the occasional startled fish. The local guide this time was a woman, older than my desert companion, her face cross-hatched with fine lines. She did not speak English, but she watched me with curious, amused eyes. We had been traveling for several hours when the river widened and the current slackened. The guide cut the engine and let the boat drift. Ahead, the water swirled around something that broke the surface. The corner of a stone block, slick with algae, its top just barely visible. "Altar," the guide said, tapping the stone with her paddle. Then she pointed beyond it, to where the river darkened. House below. A submerged temple lay entirely beneath the waterline, a drowned structure whose outlines could only be guessed at from the way the current moved. Here the river ran strangely cool, and when I trailed my fingers over the side, I felt not the solid resistance of expected depth, but an almost dizzying drop, as if the riverbed had fallen away into a chasm. I stared into the brown-green water, focusing past the reflections of clouds, until shapes began to emerge. Steps worn by countless feet descending into darkness, columns wrapped in trailing plants, carved reliefs of human figures, their faces eroded but their gestures intact, hands raised, not upward, but outward toward the river itself. "Goddess of the flood?" I guessed aloud. The guide shook her head, lips pulling back in something that was almost a smile and almost a grimace. "New goddess," she said slowly, searching for a word. Door? The river was a door. The temple was a hinge. The faithful had not come to appease some personified spirit of the water. They had come to slide open a passage between states. This much I could feel, and the way the hairs on my arms rose and the boat drifted over the submerged stairs. "You won't see much from here," said a voice at my shoulder. "The river is shy in the daytime." I did not start as violently as I had in the desert. Some part of me had been listening for that voice since I first saw the stone panel in the museum. "You're late," I said without turning. "Time is difficult to measure in places like this," the keeper replied. When I looked at him, he was sitting cross-legged in the stern of the boat, hat tipped back, bare feet trailing in the water. His coat was gone. He wore a short-sleeved shirt whose fabric clung damply to his arms. Beads of moisture glittered on his skin like tiny pearls. Besides, the river likes to decide these things. The guide did not appear to notice him. She sat at the bow, paddle resting across her knees, humming under her breath. "Is she—" I began. "She sees enough," the keeper said. "Not in the way you do, not in the way I do, but she has ferried archaeologists and pilgrims up this river for many years. She knows where it folds." "Folds?" He dipped his hand in the water, making small ripples. "Do you know how cloth bends when you gather it? Time does that too. Certain acts, repeated with enough belief, enough attention, can pinch the fabric of years. Shrines are often built at such pinches. Every prayer, every offering, tightens the fold, drawing different eras closer, till—" He snapped his fingers lightly. "You have a place where moments seep between centuries, very useful for those who wish to speak with their dead, or their gods, or their unborn descendants. And when no one comes anymore—" "Ah," he smiled. "And the fold does not simply straighten. It cannot. It is knotted now, like muscle grown around an old wound. The shrine falls silent, but the bend remains. Such places are resonant. Time eats its own tail there, in small, strange ways." We drifted over the submerged stairs again. This time, as I gazed down, the brown-green murk cleared for a heartbeat. I saw not just steps and shadows, but flickers of movement. People in garments woven from reeds, bearing clay jars. A procession of children scattering flower petals into the current. A woman with braided hair kneeling on the lowest step, arms spread as if to embrace the water. For an instant, her eyes rose to meet mine, and they held a grief so vast it cracked something in my chest. Then a leaf bumped against the side of the boat. The water clouded, and the vision dissolved. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "Yes," the keeper said quietly. "Who was she?" "Once, she was their doorkeeper. She knew the currents by taste, the moods of the river by the way it curved around her knees. When the tides of their history turned, she stood here and watched their world drown. There was nothing she could sacrifice that would have stopped it. The flood was not a god's wrath or a moral lesson. It was an upstream glacier melting, a tectonic plate shuddering. And yet, because she was keeper of the door, she felt responsible." "She still feels responsible," I said, my throat tight. Time does not forgive as easily as you think, he said. It does not punish either. It simply remembers, and in remembering, it holds certain gestures in place. The guide spoke then, in rapid phrases I could not follow, and pointed toward the shore. A tangle of roots and moss there concealed a narrow opening, a dark slit in the river bank. Side door, the keeper said. Come. The cave was damp, close, dripping with the slow patience of minerals. We walked single file, our flashlights picking out glistening stone formations and pale blind insects. The air smelled of earth, something else, a faint metallic tang, as if the river's blood had seeped into the rock. The passage widened abruptly into a cavern, whose ceiling was strung with stalactites, like petrified fangs. The floor sloped gently down toward a still pool. Its surface was so smooth it might have been stone, but when I stepped closer, I saw my reflection shiver. Around the pool's rim, set into the rock, were carvings, the same archway motif I'd seen on the museum panel, repeated and varied. Some arches opened onto stylized waves, others onto curling clouds, others onto blankness. This, said the keeper, was their inner temple. Here they made their exchanges. Exchanges? Memories for omens, promises for postponements. You would call it prayer, they called it bargaining. I knelt at the edge of the pool. In its still depths, the reflection of the cave roof seemed impossibly far away, as if the water opened into a vertical shaft rather than a shallow basin. When I reached out, intending to test its depth, the keeper's hand closed gently around my wrist. Careful, he said. This place is not as abandoned as it looks. As if to confirm that, a drop of water fell from a stalactite and hit the pool with a soft plink. Rings spread outward, distorting my reflection. For an instant, I saw not my own face, but a rapid sequence of others. A man with ritual scars across his cheeks, a girl with hair braided in riverine patterns, an old woman whose eyes were filmed with cataracts, but whose gaze still burned. Are those the worshippers? I asked, shaking. In a way, the keeper released my wrist. Little echoes, trapped in the knot of time here. When you remember someone intensely, you bind them into your personal past. When enough people remember together, they carve a kind of channel through time. And those people are gone, but the place remains. The channel can fill with reflections. Ghosts, I said, if you like, but not in the sense of spirits with unfinished business. Think of them as habits of memory the world itself has developed. These are places where time remembers how it was used. I thought of the river temple, visible only as broken outlines beneath the surface, of the woman on the steps, whose grief still vibrated in my bones. Why show me this? I whispered. Why are you bringing me to these cathedrals? The keeper crouched beside me. The pool's dim light picked out small lines around his eyes that I did not recall seeing before. Because you are listening, he said. Because you're tired of noise and hungry for the deeper hum beneath it. Because there is a danger in forgetting that everything you think is permanent will one day be a drowned stare or a desert groove, and yet the imprint of your gestures will endure. Because some stories are only complete when someone agrees to carry them forward, not as dogma, but as understanding. He dipped 2 fingers into the water. For a moment the pool darkened, and in its depths I saw, not the past, but something that might have been the future. The same river, narrower, its banks choked with plastic and rusting metal, skyscrapers rising in the hazy distance, a small child peering into a muddy puddle between broken concrete slabs, her expression filled with the same aching curiosity I had felt in the desert temple. Then the vision passed. "This is the second cathedral," the keeper said softly. "There will be others. There is a monastery in the mountains that erased its own scriptures. There is a city underneath a city where every faith burned itself into frescoes no one can read. There is a temple above the clouds, and one below the ice." "And you keep them all?" I asked. "I visit," he said. "I listen. I speak when someone comes with the right kind of questions. Call it keeping, if you like. Time does not need a custodian, but humans often do." He rose and held out a hand. "You are not done yet. The path is long." As I took his hand and let him lead me back through the dripping cave, the sense of walking not just through space, but through a thickening weave of years settled around me like a cloak. The silent cathedrals of time were not just ruins. They were mirrors in which my own era, my own restless, distracted age, might someday be reflected as a faint, shimmering image. Somewhere in an unimaginable future, a stranger might press their hand to a cracked screen or fragment of printed page and feel a faint echo of our questions. The thought was both humbling and strangely comforting. When we emerged from the cave into the blind white glare of day, the river roared past as if it had never paused. The guide shaded her eyes, looked at me and nodded once, as if something had been decided. "You are not the first to come," the keeper said, "and you will not be the last. Time is generous with its invitations, even if most people decline without knowing they were asked." "How many more are there?" I asked. His smile held both mischief and sorrow. "Enough." We boarded the boat. The current took us, carrying us back towards settlements and roads and the thin skein of Wi-Fi that stitched the modern world together. But I felt as though a deeper current had caught me, one that flowed not just from upriver to downriver, but from before to after, from forgotten to not yet known. The silent cathedrals were waiting, their stones patient, their drowned steps steady under the weight of water. Somewhere in mountain air or city dust, other forgotten faiths had left their houses standing, not to demand worship, but to offer remembrance. I did not yet know their names, but time and the keeper would show me, and so the journey went on. The mountains greeted me with thin air, and a silence that felt sharper than any I had known in desert or jungle. On the map, the region was a tangle of contour lines and sparse place names, a high range straddling the border between languages, between climates, between histories. Travelers came here to climb, to trek, to stand on ridges and take photographs of themselves against distant peaks. Very few came for the monastery that lay tucked in a side valley, several days' journey from the nearest marked trail. By then, I had learned that the world's forgotten sanctuaries seldom appeared where brochures suggested. The path up to the monastery wound through forests of stunted pines and over scree slopes, where every step sent small avalanches of stones clattering into the ravine below. My guide this time was a wiry young man with a calm smile and a habit of humming tunelessly under his breath. He had never heard of the place I described, but when I showed him my hand-drawn map, a composite of hints from old journals, expedition reports, and a half-deciphered inscription from a museum cellar, his eyes widened. My grandfather spoke of such a place, he said. The monastery that turned its back on the world. He said the monks there erased their own words. I thought it only a story to frighten children into finishing their lessons. We camped in the last scraps of tree line, where the wind combed the grass in restless waves. Stars came out in brittle, dazzling profusion. It was too cold for many insects, and the quiet was so complete that the crackle of the campfire sounded like distant thunder. I lay awake long after my guide's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep. Above me, the Milky Way arched like a pale scar across the sky. I thought of the desert temples' vanished constellations, of the rivers' remembered rituals, and wondered what kind of wound or healing had taken place in the monastery we were approaching. "You are closer than you think," said a voice from the darkness. I turned my head. The keeper sat at the edge of the firelight, hat in his hands, boots dusted with a thin sheen of frost. The light from the embers painted hollows under his cheekbones, and his eyes reflected the flames in pinpoints of gold. "You never seem to be out of breath," I said, "or hungry, or tired." "I get what I need in other places," he said, "not in ways you would find comforting." He tilted his head back to regard the stars. "This is a good sky. It belongs to more than one faith." "What do you mean?" "Think of all the pilgrims who walked under it," he said. "Followers of mountain gods and sun gods, hermits and poets, saints and skeptics, men and women who climbed these paths with hearts full of prayers, and others who simply came seeking a quiet hour away from the noise below. They all looked up. They all saw these stars. Whatever names they gave that experience, the light itself was common currency." "And the monastery?" I asked. "What did they see?" "For a long time, too long perhaps, they saw only their own reflections," he said. "Come, sleep if you can. Tomorrow you will see what's left." Morning was a slow unfurling of light over peaks and ridges. We packed our tent with numb fingers and set out along a narrow path that clung to the mountainside like a thought that would not fully form. The air grew thinner with each step, and my breath came in short, painful pulls. Then the trail rounded a shoulder of rock, and the monastery revealed itself. It clung to the cliff face as if grown from it, a cluster of stone buildings with sloping roofs, their wooden beams silvered with age. A long stairway, partly carved into the rock and partly constructed from rough-hewn blocks, led up to a heavy wooden gate. Colourful prayer flags once stretched from the roofs to poles sunk into the cliff, but time and weather had shredded them into faint, faded streamers. As we approached, my guide slowed, then stopped altogether. "I will not go further," he said, eyes fixed on the gate. "This place has a feeling. I do not like it." "You believe the stories your grandfather told, then?" I asked. "I believe my bones," he said simply. "They say no. I will wait here. If you do not return by sunset, I will go down and speak your name at the village shrine." "Is that a blessing?" I asked, attempting a smile. "It is whatever you need it to be," he replied gravely. I left him there and climbed the steps alone. Each one felt slightly different in height, as if they had been carved by many hands over many years, each mason making subtle adjustments based on his own stride. The air smelled of stone dust and old incense. The gate stood ajar. There was no lock. No chain, no sign forbidding entry. Only an absence, as if the building itself had drawn in a breath and never let it go. I stepped inside. The courtyard was larger than I'd expected, framed by cloistered walkways and low buildings. Empty flagpoles rattled softly in the wind. A well sat at its center, its stone lip worn smooth beyond the far wall. The nightens reared up, staggering in their indifference. This was not always an abandoned place, the keeper said, peering beside the well, as if he had stepped out of my shadow. His breath did not smoke in the cold air. Mine did. I gathered that much, I said. They were devout, he went on. Devout in the way only those convinced of their own smallness can be. Their faith taught that words were traps, that to name the divine was to limit it. And so they praised their God in paradoxes and silence, in gestures and patterns. For centuries, this worked very well. We walked along the cloister. The walls were painted with murals, but at first glance they seemed nothing more than foggy smears of grey, brown, and faded blue. Figures emerged only when I looked closely. Kneeling monks, mountain spirits, stylized flames. All of them had been partially obscured by later brushstrokes of white, as if someone had tried to erase the images without quite succeeding. What happened? I asked. The same thing that happens to any system devoted to purity, the keeper said quietly. They turned inward. They began to fear contamination, not from enemies or outsiders, but from their own thoughts. Each time someone tried to articulate a teaching, another would point out the limitation in those words. Each attempt to praise their God was discovered to be inadequate, insulting even once examined. They became obsessed with erasing their own mistakes. He gestured toward the murals. These are not the work of iconoclasts from outside. This is the work of the monks themselves. They painted their vision of heaven, then repented for having dared to depict it, and covered it in white. They wrote hymns, then burned them for having presumed to describe the indescribable. We entered a long hall whose walls were lined with shelves. At least they had once been. Now most of the shelves were empty, their wood carved with shallow repetitive grooves, where scrolls or books had once rested. A few scraps of parchment lay scattered on the floor, their ink washed into illegibility by water or time. Eventually, the keeper said, they ceased creating and devoted themselves entirely to uncreating. They studied their own archives only to hunt for error. When they found what they deemed a dangerous phrase, they scraped it off the page and carefully recorded the act of scraping in another volume, which they would later also condemn as presumptuous and destroy. They saw this as a kind of holy pruning. They believed that if they removed every impure thought, what remained would be pure awareness. What remained? I asked, already knowing the answer. He spread his hands toward the empty shelves. This. They succeeded more completely than they intended. Their books are gone, their paintings obscured, their music forgotten. The last generation left behind detailed instructions for erasing even their own names. And yet the monastery stands, I said. Yes. He looked at me with something like pride. For all their efforts to disentangle themselves from history, they left a very clear imprint on time. Their devotion to erasure became, ironically, the most indelible part of their legacy. That is why this place is one of the cathedrals. I ran my fingers over the nearest shelf. The grooves in the wood felt oddly familiar, like an echo of the desert temple's lines and the river shrine's arches. Do they haunt it? I asked. The monks? Not in the way you mean. He led me to the far end of the hall, where a single book remained on a pedestal, wrapped in rotting cloth. Their ghosts are not personalities, but practices watch. He did not touch the book. Instead, he blew gently across its surface. Dust rose like smoke, swirling in the slanting light from a high window. For a moment, the particles hung in the air in patterns. Letters, words, sentences in a script I did not recognize. They seemed to form, hesitate, and then, as if ashamed of their own daring, disperse. Even now, the keeper murmured, the habit of erasure persists. This building has a reflex against being pinned down. Is there anything left of what they believed? I asked. Any trace of their god, their teachings? He thought for a long moment. They believed that the divine was what remained when you let go of every image, every idea, every story, he said at last. In that sense, their God is everywhere there is silence, here especially. We stood and listened. The silence was not empty. It was dense with things unsaid, with words that had once hung in the air and been carefully disassembled. It felt like standing in a library after a great fire, the phantom of knowledge lingering like heat on the walls. In that silence, I heard, faintly, the murmuring of my own age, the constant production of commentary, the endless stream of opinions, the fear of missing a moment, a trend, a phrase. For a heartbeat, I felt a fierce kinship with those monks, their longing to carve away the unnecessary to reveal something essential beneath. But I also saw their mistake. In their zeal to purify, they had cut themselves away not only from error, but from relationship. Their faith had become a mirror turned on itself until it reflected nothing at all. That is why it is valuable as a cathedral, the keeper said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. Not because they were right or wrong, but because they show one way a human longing can twist when taken to its extreme. Time remembers such experiments. We left the hall and climbed a narrow stair to the rooftop. From there, the view was staggering. Mountains rising in serried ranks, valleys dropping away into blue haze, the sky an immense, translucent bowl overhead. Wind tugged at my clothes and slipped cold fingers into my hair. Once, they came up here to watch the dawn, the keeper said. They believed that if they could greet the first light without a single word arising in their minds, they would be free of all illusions. Did anyone succeed? I asked. He smiled. You tell me. We stood together as a cloud parted, and a shaft of sunlight slid across a distant peak, igniting it in gold. For a moment, all the stories fell away. Desert temples and drowned shrines, erased scriptures and coming ruins. There was only light on rock, and the thin, sweet sting of air in my lungs. No words came, or rather many did, but they felt redundant. The experience was already complete. After a long time, the keeper spoke again. You see, even here, in the ruins of their excess, there is something to learn, not as a dogma, but as a perspective. These places remember not only their builders' mistakes, but their glimpses of understanding. Is that why you call them cathedrals? I asked. I rarely call them anything, he said. You were the one who named them that, in your notes after the desert temple. Silent cathedrals of time. I liked the phrase. I stared at him. You read my notes? He shrugged. You leave them in places easy to find. On screens, in notebooks, in the backs of your thoughts. Time has a way of catching such things. His expression softened. Names matter. They shape how you attend to the world. You could have called these ruins dead religions or failed cults. You chose cathedrals of time. That tells me something about what you're ready to hear. And what is that? I asked. That you're beginning to see faith not as a set of answers, but as an ongoing conversation with what exceeds you, he said. And that you're ready to see how the conversation continues even after the words have been forgotten. We descended from the roof. As we left the monastery, I felt the silence stretch behind us, like a held breath finally released. My guide was waiting where I had left him, sitting on a rock and tossing small stones into the ravine. When he saw me, relief softened his features. You went very still, he said. Even from here, I could feel it. Did you ever think of becoming a monk? I asked impulsively. He laughed. No. I like food and songs too much. My grandfather says a faith that forgets to dance is sick. We began the long journey back to the world of roads and networks. The mountains slowly receded behind us, their white peaks bright against the sky. Days folded into weeks. My life became a series of thresholds. Airport gates, station platforms, border crossings. Between each, a cathedral. There was the underground city, discovered beneath a modern metropolis when workers digging a new subway tunnel broke through into a frescoed chamber. Officially, it was sealed off for preservation. Unofficially, the keeper and I slipped in one damp evening, our flashlights catching gleams of gold and pigment on walls that told stories in a dozen styles. Here, a serpent god devouring its tail circled a Christian saint. There, a wheel of reincarnation turned beneath a crescent moon. Generations of conquerors had painted over each other's symbols, only for the next to do the same, until the walls were a palimpsest of devotion and triumph, fear and hope. No single faith remained intact. The cathedral there was not to a god, but to the human urge to inscribe meaning on stone. There was the cavern beneath a glacier, reachable only by crawling through a tunnel of blue ice. The air inside was so cold it burned. At its heart lay a ring of standing stones, slick with ancient frost, their arrangement calculated to catch the pale light filtering through the ice above. People who had built it were long gone, their culture obliterated by shifting climate and migrating beasts. But on certain days of the year, the keeper told me, the light still aligned perfectly, pouring down in a column that turned the frozen air into liquid gold. A cathedral, he said to Patience. There was a small island in a great lake, occupied now only by birds. Once, a temple there had housed a statue of a god of echoes and returns. Now, only the pedestal remained, its surface colonized by moss. When the wind blew just right between the rocks, the sound of the waves striking the shore resolved into something like chanting, a low, repetitive murmur that seemed to answer itself. Each place left an imprint on me, a texture, a mood, a question. Gradually, my sense of time shifted. The present felt less like a point on a line and more like a room in a vast building, connected by doorways to other rooms, some bright, some dark, some piled with forgotten furniture, others bare and echoing. One evening, As we sat on a hill overlooking a city whose lights spread out like spilled jewels, I asked the keeper, "Do the cathedrals ever end? Is there a last one?" "There is a last one for you," he said. "Time is long. Your life is not. At some point, your body will say, 'Enough.'" "And for you?" I ventured. "Do they end for you?" He smiled in a way that made him look for a heartbeat, very tired. "I am not bound to time the way you are," he said. "But that does not mean I am free of it. I am. An arrangement it has tried on. One of the ways it has chosen to speak to itself. When I am no longer needed, I will unravel. Something else will take my place." "That sounds lonely," I said. "Loneliness is just a name for a certain arrangement of attention," he replied. "When you're listening deeply, you're never truly alone." The last cathedral he showed me did not yet exist, or rather, it existed in more than one sense, folded into a knot of time I could only glimpse from the corner of my mind's eye. We met in a field on the outskirts of a sprawling city, under a sky lit not by stars, but by a dull orange haze. The air smelled of exhaust and distant rain. Construction cranes stood like skeletal fingers against the horizon. "There," the keeper said, pointing toward a cluster of unfinished towers. "Look." I looked. At first, I saw only the obvious: concrete pillars, steel girders, glass panels reflecting the murky sky. Then, as I let my gaze soften, other images began to seep through. A soaring hall of light and shadow, its walls lined not with stone carvings, but with screens, 1,000 small rectangles, each displaying a different pattern of color and motion. People moved through the hall, their faces lit from below by the pale glow of devices in their hands. Some knelt, not before statues, but before abstract diagrams, immersive projections of data streams and orbits. Others sat in silence, eyes closed, listening to a hum that seemed to rise from the very bones of the building. "This is a temple?" I asked, startled. "In one branch of possibility," the keeper said. "A sanctuary built for a faith that has not yet fully named itself. A faith in human continuity, perhaps, or in consciousness as a pattern that can be stored and reassembled. They will call it many things. Some will come here believing they can pray themselves into servers. Others will come simply because it is quiet and beautiful." In the vision, I saw a child standing at the center of the hall, looking up at a ceiling that displayed a simulation of the universe. Galaxies wheeling in slow, stately arcs around her, murmured debates about ethics and personhood, identity and replication, rose and fell like incense. "What happens to it?" I asked. "What happens to all temples?" the keeper said. "It flourishes, it divides, is fought over, defended, abandoned. Its screens go dark when the power grid fails. Its servers decay. Moisture seeps into its walls. Centuries later, someone stands where you're standing now, staring at a fragment of its architecture protruding from a hillside, and wonders what those people believed." My chest tightened. "Then why show it to me?" "Because you live nearer to this possibility than to those we have seen," he said gently. "Because your choices, collective, not individual, will help determine whether this future faith is born gentle or cruel, inclusive or exclusive, attuned to the rest of the world, or sealed in its own hall of mirrors." "And the cathedral," I whispered, "will it be one too?" "Oh, yes." His eyes shone with a sober kind of joy. "Time will remember it, as it remembers all the places where humans try to speak, with what they did not fully understand. It will be one of the silent cathedrals someday, just as your era's screens and towers will be. I am showing you so that when you walk through your own temples, be they churches or offices, data centers or shopping malls, you will feel the weight of that continuity. The vision faded. The half-built towers stood in the orange glow, skeletal and ordinary. I looked at the keeper. So, what am I meant to do with all this? I asked. I'm just one person. I've seen deserts and rivers, ice and stone, future screens and past walls. I've listened, like you said. But what now? Now, he said, you remember, when you feel tempted to declare that your own time is uniquely enlightened or uniquely doomed, you remember these cathedrals. When you hear people speak with contempt of those who believe differently, you recall the care with which they carved stone, the patience with which they aligned their devotions to stars or rivers or empty air. When you yourself feel the tug toward erasing what you once held dear, you remember the monastery and ask whether you are pruning or cutting your own roots. That doesn't sound like much, I said. It is not spectacular, he agreed, but it is how time stays honest with itself. It is also how you stay human in the face of your own impermanence. We walked in silence for a while, our footsteps crunching on gravel. The city's noise grew as we approached, a wash of engines and sirens, voices and vibrations. Somewhere a billboard flickered, its advertisement briefly glitching into a pattern of static that looked for an instant like a broken circle with a triangle at its heart. I stopped. That symbol, I said. I've seen it in every place we visited. Desert temple, river shrine, glacier cave, underground city. What is it? He followed my gaze, then smiled. An old sigil, one of time's little jokes, perhaps, or one of the ways humans across ages and cultures have tried to draw the feeling of being between things. The circle broken, the point suspended in the center. Between what? I asked. Between before and after, he said, between knowing and not knowing, between worship and forgetting. The cathedrals all stand in such in-between places, so do you. You too, I said. He inclined his head. So do I. We reached a busy intersection. Pedestrians surged around us, each carrying a world of private rituals and unspoken beliefs. No one seemed to notice the thin, slightly out-of-place man at my side, or the way the light around him did not quite behave like the light around anyone else. This is where we part for now, he said. Will I see you again? I asked. He considered. In a way, you see me whenever you stand in an old doorway and feel the weight of years, whenever you touch a relic and sense that you're not the first to love or fear it, whether I am there as a person, in this shape. He shrugged. Time will decide. I wanted to ask more about his origins, his nature, the mechanics of his appearances, but I had visited enough cathedrals by then to recognize that some doors should remain half open. Their power lay not in neat explanations, but in the spaces they left for wonder. Instead, I said, "Thank you for guiding me." "It is what I am arranged to do," he replied. Then softer, "And it has been pleasant. Not everyone who comes to these places listens as you have. Not everyone asks questions without demanding answers that fit in their pockets." He stepped back. The crowd flowed between us, a river of bodies. For an instant, his hat rose above the sea of heads like a small, dark boat. Then it was gone. I stood there in the heart of a living city, listening. Under the honk of horns and the buzz of electricity, I heard other sounds, the distant ring of a chisel on stone, the slap of river water against steps, the rasp of a brush scraping away pigment, the low chant of voices rising in a room lit by screens and stars. All of it was time, speaking in different registers. All of it was prayer, in a sense. Even the atheist's careful experiment, the skeptic's diligent question, the child's repetition of a rhyme she did not yet understand. Later, I would return to my work, framing what I had seen in words that could be printed, archived, argued over. Some readers would call it myth, others metaphor, others perhaps hallucination. That was all right. The cathedrals did not need belief. They had stone and water, ice and data, wind and light. They had the long, slow attention of time itself. But when I sat down to write, I began with a simple sentence, one that had grown in me over the miles and years. There are buildings that remember us better than we remember ourselves. From there, the stories unfolded, of deserts and rivers, monasteries and glaciers, underground cities and future halls. I wrote them not as instructions, but as invitations, not to worship, but to listen. Somewhere, in a temple whose roof had fallen centuries before I was born, dust stirred. In a drowned stairwell, a ripple passed through water, older than any of my words. In a mountain hall of empty shells, the air seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath. And in the great cathedral without walls, the slow, turning architecture of time itself, a note sounded, very small, but very clear, and went on ringing long after my pen lifted from the page, the vanishing of Roanoke Colony. The salt wind cut across the sound with a sharpness that made Eleanor Dare pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She stood at the edge of the settlement, watching the grey waters stretch endlessly toward England, toward home, toward a rescue that had not come. Behind her, the crude houses of Roanoke sat like broken teeth against the tree line, their timber walls already weathering to the colour of old bone in the relentless coastal air. It had been nearly 3 years since John White had sailed away, promising to return with supplies within months. 3 years of dwindling hope, of watching the horizon for sails that never appeared, of stretching provisions thinner and thinner, until the very act of survival had become their only occupation. Eleanor's daughter Virginia toddled beside her, now a sturdy child of 3, born into this strange new world with no memory of the old one. The girl bent to examine a shell, her small fingers tracing its spiraled ridges with the solemnity of a scholar. Eleanor felt her heart constrict. What future awaited this child? What had they condemned her to by bringing her here? By staying when every rational impulse screamed for them to find some way, any way, back across that merciless ocean. Ellie. The voice belonged to Ananias, her husband, emerging from the palisade gate. His face had grown leaner over the months, carved down to essential angles by hunger and worry. Mateus returned. He says we need to gather everyone. There's news. Eleanor scooped Virginia into her arms and followed Ananias back through the gate. The settlement proper was a sorry sight. 12 houses arranged around a central square, a church that had never been properly finished, and the fort itself, whose walls seemed to grow more fragile with each passing storm. The colonists were gathering near the well. their faces etched with that peculiar expression she'd come to recognize. Hope and dread, in equal measure, the two emotions so intertwined they'd become indistinguishable. Manteo stood in the center of the crowd, his bearing as dignified as ever despite the obvious exhaustion in his eyes. He was Croatoan, one of the few natives who had remained friendly to the English settlement, and over the years he had become more than just their interpreter. He was their lifeline, their only connection to understanding this land they'd so presumptuously claimed. "The Sekatan are moving," Manteo said without preamble. His English had become flawless over his time with him, though he retained a cadence that made each word sound like it carried more weight than an Englishman's speech. "Not just one village, all of them. They're going inland, away from the coast." "Why?" Governor White's assistant, a man named Harvey, stepped forward. He'd assumed unofficial leadership in White's absence, though no one had explicitly granted him the authority. "Have they said anything about us?" Manteo's expression was grave. "They don't speak of you at all. That's what troubles me. Among my people, there are stories. When the great sickness came, before you English knew this land existed, it moved like wind through dry grass. Village after village fell silent. The Sekatan, remember. They're moving because they fear it's coming again." A murmur rippled through the colonists. Disease was the invisible enemy, more frightening than any warrior's arrow. They'd been fortunate so far. Aside from the usual flux and fever, nothing catastrophic had struck the settlement. But fortune, Eleanor knew, was a fickle companion. "There's more," Manteo continued. "The Wepemiok to the north have stopped trading. The Chawanok will not even let messengers approach their villages. Something is wrong in this land, and you English sit here at the edge of it, waiting for a rescue that—" He stopped himself, but the unspoken words hung in the air like smoke. A rescue that will never come. That night, Eleanor lay beside Ananias in their narrow bed, listening to Virginia's soft breathing from the corner where her daughter slept on a pallet stuffed with cattail down. The darkness was complete, the kind of darkness England had forgotten, unbroken by street lamps or watchfires beyond the palisade's edge. "We should have left with the others," Ananias whispered. He meant the smaller group that had departed months ago, determined to sail north to the Chesapeake Bay, where the land was rumored to be more hospitable. No one knew if they'd made it. "We didn't have a choice," Eleanor replied, though the words felt hollow. There had been a choice, technically, but with Virginia still nursing, with the boat barely seaworthy, with the risks multiplying with every mile from the only shelter they knew, the choice had been an illusion. "Manteo's right. Your father isn't coming back." Eleanor had suspected as much for months, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that thought never could. John White, her father, the governor who'd left them here, either dead in England or trapped by circumstance, or perhaps he'd simply moved on, found excuses not to return to this failed colony at the edge of the world. "Then we need to decide what we're going to do," she said. "All of us, together." The meeting was held 3 days later in the unfinished church. All 112 remaining colonists crowded into the space, their faces illuminated by tallow candles that gave off more smoke than light. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. Harvey stood at the makeshift altar, trying to project authority he didn't quite possess. "We have 3 options as I see it," First, we stay here and continue waiting for relief from England. Second, we attempt to build vessels and sail to the Chesapeake, following the others. Third, he paused, clearly uncomfortable with what came next. We abandon the settlement entirely and seek to join with one of the native tribes. The last suggestion provoked immediate uproar. "Leave us savages?" someone shouted. "We're Christian Englishmen." "We're starving Christian Englishmen," replied Thomas Stevens, one of the assistants, "and our children are starving. I'd rather live as a savage, as you put it, than die as a proud corpse." Arguments erupted across the church. Eleanor held Virginia close, covering the child's ears against the rising voices. She caught Monteo's eye across the room. He stood against the wall, observing with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not judgment, exactly. Perhaps pity. It was Dinas Harvey who finally restored order, slamming his hand against the altar with such force that the candles jumped. "Enough. We'll put it to a vote. But understand this. Whatever we choose together. This colony survives as one or dies as one." The debate stretched late into the night. The younger colonists, those without families, largely favoured the Chesapeake option. Movement seemed better than slow decay. The older ones, exhausted by the years of hardship, were divided between staying and seeking native protection. The families with children were the most fearful, paralysed by the knowledge that any choice might doom their offspring. Finally, as the candles burned to stubs, a compromise emerged. They would prepare to leave Roanoke, but not yet. First, they would send scouts to make contact with the Croatoan, Manteo's people, to determine if the tribe would accept them. Simultaneously, they would begin gathering materials to carve messages indicating where they'd gone, in case rescue did eventually arrive. And they would wait until spring, giving them time to prepare properly, and giving Governor White one last season to fulfill his promise. Eleanor voted with the majority, though her heart wasn't in it. Delay and compromise, the English way. She wondered what the Croatoan would think of a people who couldn't decide their own fate, even as it slipped away. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north with unusual ferocity. The sound froze in places, something Manteo said he'd never seen before. Cold crept through every gap in the timber walls, and the colonists burned through their firewood at an alarming rate. Hunting parties returned empty-handed more often than not, the deer having moved to better forage elsewhere. It was during one of these hunting expeditions that William Withers disappeared. He'd gone out with 3 other men, tracking a deer trail through the woods. When the others returned at dusk, Withers wasn't with them. "We spread out," explained John Gibbs, his face pale, "to cover more ground. When we called for him to regroup, there was no answer. We searched until the light failed, but..." He trailed off helplessly. Search parties went out the next morning. They found Withers' musket propped against a tree, his powder horn beside it, carefully placed as if he'd set them down intentionally. But of the man himself, there was no trace. No signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away through the snow. It was as if he'd simply evaporated. The disappearance cast a pall over the settlement darker than any winter storm. People began to remember other strange occurrences, tools that went missing and reappeared in different locations, sounds in the forest that didn't match any known animal, the sensation of being watched when working outside the palisade, Things that had seemed like imagination or coincidence now took on sinister significance. "My people have stories," Manteo said when Eleanor asked him about it. They were alone in the storehouse, taking inventory of the dwindling grain supplies. About the forest swallowing people, not killing them, swallowing them, taking them into itself. But these are old stories from before my grandfather's time. "Do you believe them?" Anteo was quiet for a long moment, measuring out another pound of cornmeal. "I believe that this land is older than your people understand. You see a forest and think it's just trees. You see the sound and think it's just water. But everything here has presence, awareness. Does that sound like madness to you?" "A month ago, I would have said yes," Eleanor admitted. "Now I'm not sure what I believe anymore." The winter deepened. 3 more colonists died, 2 from fever, 1 from an injury that festered despite all attempts at treatment. They buried them outside the palisade, the frozen ground requiring hours of labor to dig each grave. Eleanor noticed that they'd stopped marking the graves with crosses. It seemed pointless somehow, as if the symbols of their faith had lost meaning in this place. Virginia grew thinner despite Eleanor's best efforts. The child didn't complain. She was too young to remember anything different. But Eleanor could see her daughter's ribs pressing against her skin, could feel the delicate fragility of her bones when she picked her up. At night, Eleanor would lie awake, calculating how many more weeks they could survive on current rations, trying to decide which future was worse. Slow starvation here, or the risks of moving on. Spring came reluctantly, the ice breaking up with sounds like distant cannon fire. The colonists emerged from their houses pale and weak, blinking in the stronger light like creatures dragged from underground. Of the 112 who'd survived to winter, they'd lost 9 more. 103 souls remained, waiting to learn their fate. Anteo returned from Croatoan Island in early April, with cautious news. His people would accept them, but not as colonists maintaining a separate community. If the English came, they would come as supplicants, willing to adopt Croatoan ways, to intermarry, to become part of the tribe rather than remain apart. There would be no maintaining of English identity, no clinging to their former lives. "It's assimilation," Harvey said flatly, when Monteo delivered the message to the gathered colonists. "Cultural extinction." "It's survival," countered Eleanor. She stood with Virginia on her hip, the child's weight almost nothing now. "We can preserve our stories, our knowledge, even if we change how we live." "Isn't that better than preserving nothing but our pride?" The argument that followed was the fiercest yet. Families split on the issue. Friends who'd crossed an ocean together found themselves on opposite sides. The younger generation, especially those born here or who'd arrived as children, were more willing to adapt. The older colonists saw it as a betrayal of everything they'd sacrificed to establish. In the end, no consensus emerged. Instead, the colony fractured along the very fault lines they'd tried so hard to avoid. Roughly half, led by Harvey and several of their original assistants, decided they would make for the Chesapeake after all, trusting in their English resourcefulness and God's providence. The other half, including Eleanor, Ananias, and Virginia, would go with Manteo to Croatoan. A smaller third group, perhaps a dozen individuals, announced they would stay at Roanoke, maintaining the settlement for when rescue inevitably arrived. Eleanor looked at their faces. True believers, everyone, unable to accept that England had forgotten them. She wanted to argue, to force them to see reason. But what right did she have? Her own choice might be just as fatal. They had 2 weeks to prepare before the departure. In that time, the colonists transformed from a single reluctant community into 3 separate groups, each convinced of their own path's righteousness and skeptical of the other's chances. The carving of the messages became a solemn ritual. They had decided to leave markers indicating where each group had gone, carved into the palisade posts and the trees nearby. For those going to Croatoan, the word was simple: Croatoan, cut deep into the wood. For the Chesapeake group, they carved directional markers and the letters CRO, intending to complete more detailed messages along their route. The staying group insisted on carving nothing, as if any message would be an admission of defeat. Eleanor watched as Ananias worked on one of the palisade posts, his knife moving with careful precision. Croton, 7 letters that represented the end of everything they'd tried to build here, and the beginning of something they couldn't quite envision. Virginia sat nearby, arranging stones in patterns only she understood, humming a tune that might have been English, or might have been something she'd heard from the Croatoan children who sometimes visited. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Ananias asked without looking up from his work. Eleanor had stopped counting how many times they'd asked each other this question. "I think we're doing a thing," she said. "Whether it's right or wrong won't be clear until it's too late to change it." The night before the departures, the 3 groups held a final meal together. It was a meager affair, thin stew and hard bread, but they'd pooled their resources for this one last gesture of unity. Someone produced a fiddle and played old English tunes that made Eleanor's throat tight with longing for a country she'd left behind so many years ago. It felt like another lifetime. John Bridger, one of those staying behind, stood to speak. He was an older man, weathered by a hard life even before coming to Roanoke. "I bear no ill will to those departing," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "I understand your reasons, but I made a promise to Governor White, to the Queen, to myself, that I would hold this ground for England. Some promises can't be broken just because they become inconvenient." There was scattered applause, though Eleanor noticed it came mostly from his own group. The rest simply nodded respectfully, too tired for argument, too focused on their own anxieties about the morning. Anteo spoke next, his words measured and careful. "My people have a saying. The river doesn't care which direction you face when you drown. This land will be here long after all our decisions are forgotten. What matters is how we treat each other in the time we have. You English have strange ways, but you've also shown honor and friendship. Whatever comes next, that won't be forgotten." The meal dissolved into smaller conversations, people saying their farewells to friends they might never see again. Children who'd played together every day of their lives cried and clung to each other, not understanding why they had to separate. Parents made promises to meet again that everyone knew were lies told from kindness rather than conviction. Eleanor found herself face to face with Margaret Lawrence, who'd been her closest friend since the voyage over. Margaret's family had chosen the Chesapeake route, believing the rumours of better land and the possibility of encountering other English settlements to the north. "Tell me we'll see each other again," Margaret said, gripping Eleanor's hands with surprising strength. Eleanor wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but found she couldn't. "Tell me you'll survive," she said instead. Tell me your children will grow old and have children of their own, and that someday, somehow, our grandchildren might meet and share the story of us." They held each other for a long moment, two women who'd crossed an ocean together, born children in a wilderness, and watched dreams crumble like sand. When they separated, both were crying, but neither apologized for it. The departures began at first light. The Chesapeake group left first, 47 people loading their possessions onto rough carts and hoisting packs onto their backs. They'd managed to construct 2 small boats from salvaged timber, barely seaworthy but sufficient for coastal travel. Their plan was to move north along the barrier islands, then inland when they found the right passage. Eleanor stood with the others watching them go, trying to memorize faces that were already beginning to fade into the morning mist. Harvey led the column, his back straight with determination or stubborn pride. It was hard to tell which. The children looked back over their shoulders, waving until their parents urged them forward. By noon, the Chesapeake group had vanished into the forest, and it was time for the Croatoan party to depart. 43 colonists remained with Manteo, including Eleanor's family. They traveled lighter than the others, having been advised by Manteo to leave behind most of their English possessions. "You can't live between 2 worlds," he'd told them. "The weight will drown you." Still, Eleanor had secreted away a few treasures. Her mother's ring, a small Bible, a lock of hair from Virginia's first cutting. Things to remember who they'd been, even as they became someone new. The journey to Croatoan Island took 3 days. They moved south along the barrier islands, through maritime forests of twisted live oaks, and across tidal marshes that sucked at their boots. Manteo led them confidently, knowing every trail and shortcut, pointing out edible plants and warning them away from dangerous animals. On the second night, they camped on a beach with the Atlantic rolling endlessly before them. Virginia fell asleep in Eleanor's arms almost immediately, exhausted by the day's travel. Eleanor sat with Ananias, watching the waves catch the moonlight. "I keep thinking about the ones who stayed," Ananias said. 13 people in that empty settlement, waiting for a rescue that's never coming. What will they do when winter comes again? Eleanor had been trying not to think about it, but the image haunted her, Bridger and the others growing thinner and more desperate, watching the horizon with fading hope, until one by one they succumbed to hunger or disease or simple despair. She wondered if they'd maintain the settlement to the end, or if eventually they'd abandon it too, scattering into the forest to die alone. "Maybe rescue will come," she said, but the words were ash in her mouth. They reached Croatoan Island on the afternoon of the 3rd day, crossing the sound in canoes provided by Manteo's people. The Croatoan village was larger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 60 structures arranged around a central plaza with cultivated fields spreading inland. Children ran along the shore to greet them, shouting in their own language, while adults emerged from houses to observe the new arrivals with cautious curiosity. Manteo's mother, a woman named Akayan, stepped forward to welcome them. She was perhaps 60 years old, her face mapped with lines that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. She spoke in Croatoan, with Manteo translating, though Eleanor suspected the old woman understood more English than she let on. "You come to us with empty hands and full hearts," Akayan said through her son. "This is good. Those who come grasping cannot receive. We will teach you our ways, and perhaps you will teach us some of yours, and together we will see what grows from this planting." The integration was not easy. The colonists were assigned to different families within the tribe, dispersed throughout the village rather than kept together. Eleanor's family was placed with Manteo's extended household, which included his mother, 2 sisters, their husbands, and a small constellation of children whose exact relationships to each other Eleanor couldn't quite follow. The first challenge was language. Virginia, with the plasticity of childhood, picked up Croatoan words almost immediately, chattering with the other children in an increasingly hybrid tongue. Eleanor and Ananias struggled more, their adult minds resistant to new patterns. Manteo was patient, but he made it clear that learning Croatoan wasn't optional. "You can't belong to a people whose words you don't speak," he told them. The second challenge was work. The English concept of labour was different from the Croatoan way. The colonists were used to divisions between men's work and women's work, with strict hierarchies and expectations. The Croatoan had their own divisions, but they were more fluid, and the work itself was constant, attuned to the seasons and the land in ways the English had never managed. Eleanor learned to cultivate the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, planted together in a symbiotic arrangement. She learned to weave baskets from river cane and identify dozens of plants by their uses: food, medicine, tool making, spiritual practice. Her hands, already calloused from years at Roanoke, developed new toughnesses, new capabilities. Ananias learned to fish with weirs and traps, to hunt with bow rather than musket when powder grew too precious to waste. He learned to read the weather in ways that made English predictions seem like children's guessing games. He learned patience. The native hunters could sit motionless for hours, becoming part of the landscape, while Ananias fidgeted and scared away game. Virginia simply learned to be a child of 2 worlds, or perhaps of no particular world at all. She played with the Croatoan children, invented hybrid games that combined English and native elements, and seemed utterly untroubled by the transformation overtaking her family. Sometimes Eleanor would watch her daughter and realize she could no longer distinguish what was English about the child and what was something new entirely. Months passed. Summer came with its oppressive heat and violent thunderstorms. The colonists worked alongside their Croatoan hosts, attending festivals they didn't fully understand, participating in rituals that made some of them uncomfortable, but which they endured out of gratitude and necessity. Some adapted well, others struggled with every aspect of their new lives. Thomas Archard, one of the younger colonists, married a Croatoan woman named Liara in a ceremony that blended English and native customs. It was a strange affair. Eleanor couldn't help but think of it that way, with Christian prayers mixing with Croatoan songs, English vows spoken alongside promises Eleanor only partially understood. But when she looked at the couple's faces, she saw genuine affection, perhaps even love, and something in her heart eased slightly. Others were less successful. Robert Wilkinson, an older colonist who'd been a landowner in England, never reconciled himself to his reduced status. He complained constantly about the lack of privacy, the savage customs, the degradation of English people living like natives. In September, he simply disappeared. Search parties found no trace of him, and the general assumption was that he'd tried to return to Roanoke and gotten lost in the marshes. No one spoke of him after that. Eleanor noticed she thought less and less about the life she'd left behind. Daily demands of survival pushed aside nostalgia for England, for civilization, for all the things she'd once considered essential. She still missed her father, though the missing had transformed into something harder and more bitter. Not grief, but a kind of exhausted resentment at being abandoned. One evening in early autumn, as Eleanor was helping to prepare a feast for the harvest celebration, a Kayan sat beside her. The old woman's English had mysteriously improved over the months, or perhaps she'd simply decided it was time to stop pretending ignorance. "You are sad," Akayan said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor considered denying it, but found she lacked the energy. "I'm mourning," she said. "Mourning the life I thought I would have, the person I thought I was." Akayan nodded slowly. "This is wise. You cannot become new without letting the old self die. But you mourn too long, I think. The dead do not need so much attention. The living need you more." She gestured toward Virginia, who was helping the other children gather firewood, laughing at some joke Eleanor couldn't hear. The child was brown from the sun, wearing a simple shift that was more Croatoan than English, her hair loose rather than properly bound. She looked happy, she looked healthy, she looked nothing like an English girl. "Is she still mine?" Eleanor asked softly. "Or have I lost her too?" Akayan's response was unexpectedly sharp. "She was never yours. Children belong to themselves, to the future. You are only the vessel that brought her here. Now, this land claims her, and you must decide if you will let her go or try to hold her back and damage you both." The words stung, but Eleanor recognized the truth in them. She'd been clinging to Virginia as a reminder of who they used to be, using her daughter as an anchor to a past that no longer existed. It wasn't fair to the child, who had her own life to live in this strange new world. Winter came again, but this time Eleanor's family was prepared. The Croatoan houses were better insulated than the English structures had been, and the tribe's stores were carefully managed to last through lean months. There was hunger. There was always hunger in winter, but not the desperate, gnawing starvation that had characterized their final season at Roanoke. Snow fell on a February morning, unusual for the coast, but not unheard of. Virginia ran outside to play in it, her delighted shouts mixing with those of the Croatoan children. Eleanor watched from the doorway, wrapped in a deerskin cloak that Akayan had given her. Manteo approached, his breath misting in the cold air. "I'm going to Roanoke," he said without preamble, "to see what's become of those who stayed. I thought you might want to come." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. She'd spent months learning not to look back, training herself to accept the present rather than mourn the past. But curiosity and something else, responsibility, perhaps, or guilt, made her nod. "When do we leave?" They set out the next morning with 3 other Croatoan men, traveling in a large canoe across the Sound. The water was grey and choppy, winter cold and hostile. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the northern shore, watching Roanoke Island emerge from the mist like a ghost of itself. The settlement was visible from the water, or rather, its absence was visible. The palisade stood intact, but something about it looked wrong. As they drew closer, Eleanor realized what she was seeing: emptiness. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No sounds of human activity carried across the water. The place had the peculiar silence of abandonment, of life interrupted and never resumed. They beached the canoe and approached cautiously, though Eleanor couldn't have said what danger they expected. The gate stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze, with a rhythmic creak that was the only sound besides the wind and water. Inside the palisade, the settlement looked almost deliberately arranged. The houses still stood, their doors closed. Tools were stacked neatly beside workshops. The well had been carefully covered. It looked less like a place abandoned in panic, and more like a place whose inhabitants had simply decided to step away for a moment and never returned. "Where are they?" Eleanor whispered, though she didn't know why she was whispering. Anteo shook his head slowly, examining the ground. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no indication of where they went. He moved to one of the palisade posts where Ananias had carved Croatoan months before. The carving was still there, but now someone had scratched additional marks beneath it. Eleanor couldn't tell if they were letters or simple tallies. They searched the entire settlement. In one house, they found a table set for a meal that had never been eaten, the food long since rotted to dust. In another, Eleanor discovered a child's doll sitting on a neatly made bed, as if waiting for someone to return and claim it. The church held a single candle burned down to a puddle of wax on the altar. The storehouse provided the only clear evidence of intentional departure. It had been completely emptied, every last sack of grain and barrel of salt removed. That, at least, suggested planning, conscious choice. But where had they gone, and why had they left no message beyond the original carvings? Outside the settlement, they found the graves they dug the previous winter. Someone had tended them recently. The mounds were neat, marked with crosses that showed no weathering. That meant at least some of the 13 had survived into the new year. But when had they left, and why? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Anteo declared it was time to leave. "There's nothing more to learn here," he said. "The past has swallowed them, just as it's swallowing this place." Eleanor took one last look at the settlement. Despite everything, despite having left it willingly, she felt a profound sadness at seeing it abandoned. This had been their dream once, a New England, a fresh start, a chance to build something lasting. Now it was just empty buildings slowly decaying, a monument to futile ambition. On the journey back to Croatoan, Eleanor found herself thinking about the different paths her people had taken. The Chesapeake group might have found their better land, or they might have perished in the wilderness. The ones who'd stayed at Roanoke had apparently survived long enough to depart with some planning, but their ultimate fate remained unknown. And her own group, the ones who'd chosen assimilation, well, they were alive, but were they still English? Did that even matter? Years passed, measured not in calendars, but in seasons, in plantings and harvests, in storms weathered and children born. Virginia grew into a young woman who could speak Croatoan more fluently than English, who knew the names of plants her mother had never heard of, who moved through the world with a confidence Eleanor had never possessed at that age. She eventually married a man who was himself the child of mixed heritage, his father English from some earlier contact, his mother Hatteras. Their children would be something new entirely, carrying pieces of multiple worlds in their veins. Ananias adapted too, though more slowly. He kept his English name, but took a Croatoan one as well, as did all the colonists who stayed. He learned to find satisfaction in the seasonal rhythms of native life. in the collective nature of tribal existence. Sometimes Eleanor would catch him staring out across the sound toward where Roanoke lay, and she knew he was remembering who they'd been. But those moments grew rarer as time passed. Eleanor herself became someone she wouldn't have recognized at 20. She learned healing from Akayan and other tribal women, became skilled at setting bones and brewing medicines. She taught reading and writing to those Croatoan who wanted to learn, creating a hybrid literacy that used English letters to record native words and stories. She helped negotiate when other English ships occasionally appeared, though these grew less frequent over the years as England's attention turned elsewhere. The other colonists similarly transformed. Some, like Thomas Archard, fully embraced their new identities and became indistinguishable from those born Croatoan. Others maintained more visible English elements, speech patterns, certain customs, small rituals practiced in private. But all of them changed, because change was the price of survival. One spring morning, perhaps 7 or 8 years after they'd left Roanoke, Eleanor was working in the fields when a runner arrived from the north with news. A group of strange people had been spotted in Chesapeake territory. Perhaps a dozen individuals speaking broken English and Algonquian, claiming to be remnants of the Roanoke colony. Eleanor's heart lurched. The Chesapeake group? The ones who'd stayed at Roanoke? Or perhaps someone else entirely? Manteo organized an expedition immediately. Eleanor insisted on joining, despite the journey's difficulty. They traveled north for days, moving through territories that required careful negotiation to pass safely. When they finally reached the Chesapeake village, where the strangers had been taken in, Eleanor barely recognized them as English at all. There were 11 of them, 4 adults and 7 children. They wore native clothing, spoke a jumbled mixture of languages, and carried themselves with the wary exhaustion of people who'd endured more than human beings should have to bear. The leader, a woman named Alice Chapman, who Eleanor vaguely remembered from Roanoke, stared at her visitors with something between hope and fear. "We're from the Croatoan group," Eleanor explained in English, the words feeling strange in her mouth after so long. "We've been living with Manteo's people. Are you from Chesapeake? From Roanoke?" Alice's laugh was bitter. "Both. Neither. We made it to the Chesapeake Bay, found the land just as unforgiving as Roanoke had been. Half our group died the first winter. The survivors split up. Some went further north, searching for Jamestown, though that was foolish, given the settlement hadn't been established yet when we left England." She paused, her expression distant. "I don't know what happened to them. The rest of us ended up here, accepted by these people out of pity, I think." "And the ones who stayed at Roanoke?" Eleanor had to ask. "Did you have any contact with them?" Alice shook her head. "We sent messengers back once, maybe 2 years after we'd left. The settlement was empty. We found the carvings, Croatoan, and assumed everyone had gone to you. You're telling me some stayed." Eleanor explained about the 13 who'd remained, but returning to find the settlement abandoned with no clear indication of where its inhabitants had gone. Alice listened with an expression of profound weariness, as if the mystery was just one more weight added to an already unbearable load. "We're all ghosts," Alice said finally. "All of us who came here. The colony vanished, and we vanished with it. England's forgotten us. Maybe they tell stories about the lost colonists, but they've moved on. We're just footnotes to someone else's history, The words settled over the group like ash. Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist that they mattered, that their struggles and survival meant something, but she couldn't find the words, because Alice was right. They were ghosts. They'd ceased to be English the moment their rescue failed to arrive, but they couldn't quite become fully native either. They existed in the space between, belonging nowhere, completely. That night, the two groups shared a meal and stories. The Chesapeake survivors had their own tales of loss and transformation, of colonists who'd married into tribes, or wandered off into the wilderness, or simply given up and died. They spoke of children who'd forgotten English entirely, of adults who'd changed their names, of the gradual erasure of everything they'd tried to bring to this new world. Eleanor told them about life on Croatoan, about the integration and adaptation, about Virginia's children who would be the first truly American generation. Not English, not simply native, but something synthesized from both. She tried to make it sound hopeful, like a new beginning rather than an ending, but she wasn't sure she succeeded. "Will you come back with us?" Eleanor asked Alice. "Join us on Croatoan. There's room, and Manteo's people are generous." Alice considered it for a long moment before shaking her head. "We've settled here, made promises, formed connections. Moving again." She trailed off, but Eleanor understood. They were too tired for another transformation, another adaptation. Better to stay with the familiar, even if that familiar was itself strange. The expedition returned to Croatoan, carrying the knowledge that some of their former companions had survived, however precariously. It should have felt like a victory, but instead Eleanor felt only a deep melancholy. The colony hadn't just vanished. It had fractured into a dozen pieces, each going its own way, each becoming something unrecognizable. There would be no reunion, no restoration of what had been lost. There was only forward, into an uncertain future that looked nothing like the dreams that had brought them across the ocean. Eleanor lived another 20 years on Croatoan, long enough to see her grandchildren, and even one great-grandchild. She taught them all the English she could, told them stories of a country across the ocean that existed more in memory than reality. But she also learned to let them go, to accept that they would be what this land made them, rather than what she'd tried to preserve. In her final years, she would sometimes walk to the shore and look north toward where Roanoke lay. She'd think about the 13 who'd stayed, about their ultimate fate, about whether they had found whatever they were looking for, or simply wandered into the wilderness and disappeared. She'd think about the Chesapeake group and all its splinters, scattered across the coast like seeds that might or might not take root. She'd think about her own people on Croatoan, who'd survived by surrendering who they'd been. The mystery of the vanished colony would, she knew, outlive her. People would wonder what happened to those lost English settlers, would speculate about their fate, perhaps send expeditions to search for answers. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than any mystery. They hadn't vanished. They'd transformed. They'd made the impossible choices that survival demanded, and in doing so had become something new, something that couldn't be easily categorized or explained. On a warm autumn evening, Eleanor sat with Virginia and watched the sun set over the sound. The light turned the water molten gold, beautiful and indifferent. Virginia's children played nearby, their laughter a blend of English words and Croatoan phrases, their games hybrid inventions that belonged to no particular tradition. "Do you regret it?" Virginia asked. "Coming here? Staying?" Eleanor thought about the question carefully. Did she regret the loss? Yes. The suffering? Certainly. The transformation that had erased so much of who they'd been? In some deep, irreducible way? Yes. But regret implied she would have chosen differently. And she wasn't sure that was true. I regret that we had to make the choice at all, she said finally. But given the choice we faced, I think we did the best we could. We survived. We adapted. We're still here, even if here isn't where we thought we'd be. Virginia nodded, accepting the answer for what it was. Not reassurance or justification, just truth. They sat together in companionable silence as the light faded and the first stars emerged. Two women spanning generations, belonging imperfectly to multiple worlds, carrying forward a story that would never be fully told because its ending was still being written in the lives of children who barely remembered that it had begun on a distant shore with ships and promises and doomed ambitions. The colony of Roanoke vanished, yes, but its people didn't disappear. They dissolved into the landscape, into other cultures, into hybrid identities that confounded the categories their English patrons would have recognized. They became the land's secret, absorbed into its vast indifference, remembered only in carvings on trees and the faint traces of foreign blood running through tribal lines. And perhaps that was the truest form of colonization after all. Not conquest, but surrender. Not triumph, but transformation. Not the changing of the new world, but the changing of those who'd hoped to change it.